Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Cup, Duet Reviews, brought to you by Cup of Hemlock Theatre. I'll be your host for this episode, Ryan Borochovitz, co-artistic producer here at Cup of Hemlock, and I'm joined by my other co-artistic producer, Mackenzie Horner. Hi, Mac. How are you doing today?
Hello, dear. Hello. I'm doing okay. It's been a day, but we're here. I'm excited to talk about this one-man show.
Yes, so today, if you didn't check the title of the thing you clicked on, we are going to be discussing Ian McKellen on stage, aka Ian McKellen's one-man show, where he talks about his life and illustrious body of work on stage and screen.
Basically, he said it's taking the place of his memoir. He doesn't want to write a memoir. He
specifically says at one point in the show that the little program note in the brochure is the closest thing to an autobiography he's ever going to write, but we could argue that maybe this show is more of that, but it belongs on stage, not on text, as his life was lived, and still is.
I was about to say, he's not dead yet.
I know, but yes. I believe this was to commemorate his 80th birthday was when they began performing this. That's what it said in the little fun facts. During the intermission. For those who would like to watch this themselves, it is currently available on National Theatre at Home, the streaming service. I believe it says that it's available until at least October 15th, but they might extend it further as they so. But yeah, we'll have the link in the description to this. If people do want to check it out, you will require a subscription.
There's lots of good stuff. You got Helen Mirren, you got Olivia Colman, I think Patrick Stewart's in there with No Man Land.
Yeah, also with McKellen.
Yep. So there's a lot of good stuff in there.
Yeah, a Harold Pinter play at the Harold Pinter Theatre, which is where this was filmed. So
all I could think about every time he talked about Harold Pinter was there's the very famous Sondheim lyric in The Ladies Who Lunch, which is a Pinter play, perhaps a bit of Mahler. I'll drink to that. So every time I think of right, exactly.
Yeah, speaking of drinking to that, what's in your cup today?
Well, so I have a bit of a 6 degrees of Ian McKellen cup today. So I went and saw the new Thor movie.
Okay.
And if you are a MCU person, then you will know the man who directed the first Thor movie was Kenneth Branagh.
Who gets mentioned a lot in this piece.
He is an on-running joke in this piece. Produced by Kenneth Branagh, directed by Kenneth Branagh, starring Kenneth Branagh. But they have worked together, him and Ian McKellen. So yeah. So there's no bitterness. I think Ian McKellen's just making it this guy does a lot of his own producing and directing work. And he's a great director.
And Ian, I'm on a first name basis with him. Ian McKellen. So he says like nothing but good things about Kenneth Branagh, even while he's making these jokes. He said that like at one point he even mentions how he and all of his actor friends thought it was absurd that Branagh wanted to do a Henry V movie after Laurence Olivier had done the definitive version, but then they saw it and it was really good, and they were very happy that he opened up the floodgates for more Shakespeare movies.
I will say that I actually prefer the Kenneth Branagh version to the Olivier version.
Oh, them's fighting words.
I know. I just find the Laurence Olivier one, while he does a great performance, it's just very theatrical. Like it's a lot of painted backdrops and very kind of plumages, and it's like it's fine. But I like the fact that in Kenneth Branagh's version, it's like it's muddy, it's dirty, you feel kind of like the dire situation. And to use a Lord of the Rings reference, you feel like the row at Helm's Deep, where it's just this unsurmountable odd of 300 to thousands of Uruk-hai. So I was like, Kenneth Branagh did a very good job.
Right.
Well, and for our Harry Potter fans who don't know who Kenneth Branagh is, he is Gilderoy Lockhart, the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher.
But this isn't a review of the filmography of Kenneth Branagh. Let's talk about McKellen.
Yes. What's in your cup, though?
Oh, yeah, I'm drinking coffee out of my The Cup cup. Hey, that's the show you're watching right now. I was going to have a spot of tea to fit the kind of Britishness of this piece.
Did you talk about coffee in this?
They do, so I felt like I could get away with having something a little more caffeinated.
Will we see you do a dramatic death scene as the old man did?
Yeah, like in the reenactment of Agatha Christie's Black Coffee. Well, no, because I actually have Coffee Mate in this, so it doesn't count as poisonous black coffee, so sorry, can't help you.
All right, let's get into this, Ryan.
Yeah, so I guess we'll start with our usual first question. Who did you think was the best performer in this piece?
That little girl.
Yeah. Well, that little girl.
Jama, I think her name is?
Yeah, I think so. But yeah, so I said this question in jest, audience who have not seen the production, because clearly the performance it's a one-man show. It is a McKellen through, but there is audience participation. And at one point he brings an adorable child on stage who gets to hold his sword in a very appropriate way. Yeah, and take a fun Polaroid selfie with him.
Gets a signed program.
Yeah.
And I think she's part of a scholarship. You mentioned at the end of how like some of the donations are going toward like a theater scholarship, and like she's part of the children's.
Oh,
did he
specifically? I didn't recall him saying that she was specifically part of it. I think
I thought he said her name.
Yeah, maybe. I could be wrong, but yeah, he specifically he says that a lot of the show was for charity and the ticket sales. He's clearly made enough money over his career, and he's giving back and making sure that children have the opportunity to attend and study theater,
which more artists should do. More artists should follow his lead.
Yeah, every eminent actor after they've had a long career, made a lot of money, should just do a one-person show where all the proceeds go to charity. That would be
exactly nice. Pay it forward. Sondheim was all about that. He used to do master classes for students all the time, just to sit and talk with them and impart knowledge. And I mean, I think Ian McKellen's doing the same thing with his show. Yeah. Like, it's a very informal presentation. Like, as you can see behind me, he's kind of in like a blazer, scarf, and running shoes. Like, he's not all posh Ian McKellen in a suit on stage.
He even dresses up in drag at one point.
Yes, a widow. What's her name? Widow.
I think I wrote it down.
Toddy? No, not Toddy. Widow.
I forgot to write it down.
Twonky?
Twonky, something.
Twinkie. Widow Twinkie.
Was it? Okay.
Yes. It was fun. The Widow Twinkie.
Yes, I was too busy laughing to take note of it because it was very fun.
Yeah. But I mean, Ian McKellen himself, I mean, I texted Ryan this when I was watching it, but I said, like, this doesn't feel like a typical one-person show where it feels very choreographed, rehearsed. Like, I will now tell my funny story about X now, and you all will laugh. And this is the same story I've told in interviews, but now I'm doing it live for you on stage. Like, one person who is notorious for this is, and I love her, but it's Patti LuPone. She's told the same joke about missing her cue in Les Mis in every one-woman show I've seen her do. And it's a very funny story.
Has she done more than one-woman show?
She's done a few. She's done like three or four one-woman shows over her life. Okay. And usually that story comes up, and it's the same verbiage, the same like rhythmic pauses and beats to like give a laugh somewhere.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's what I liked about him. It was very naturalistic. It just felt like Will, you were sitting in his tea room or his pub that he owns in London, because he does own a pub that I think was part of Dickens or Shakespeare, like something like that. Like, there's a history that like it's and that's where his Gandalf staff is hung, is in the pub, and sometimes he's there to greet people when he's not working.
But yeah, I agree that like part of what the appeal of this piece, even though it clearly was scripted to some degree and very well rehearsed, it had this like almost stand-up comedy improv kind of feel to it, where he's just like riffing off the cuff, saying funny things. And I imagine, like, for the most part, we'll probably talk more about the Act 2 Shakespeare cycle, we could call it here. But like, I think that is like a good indication of the fact that he had something to say about nearly every single Shakespeare play, and we'll talk about that in a minute.
Yes.
But it didn't really matter what order they came up in, and the fact that he made it that the audience could just shout out a play and then he would say the thing that he has to say about it. Clearly he knew what he was going to say about each one, and that was all very rehearsed, but he's just such a pro, and he's like willing to just be casual about it, that it doesn't really matter. It's not going to throw him off his rhythm to have to talk about Cymbeline earlier than Midsummer or vice versa.
Exactly. Exactly. And I mean, I loved his on-running joke of, was it As You Like It, where he plays Claudio all the time?
Much Ado About Nothing,
Much Ado. Well, was it Much Ado?
Yeah.
Yeah, Much Ado. That he keeps ending up as Claudio. The most boring part. I mean, like, the fact that he was able just to rip himself the whole time. Like, the fact that it's the running joke of, I read Lord of the Rings every year. And he's like, I never read it. And yet I play Gandalf the Grey and Gandalf the White.
And Christopher Lee was really jealous because he always saw himself as Gandalf.
Exactly. and he met Tolkien.
Yeah, and he was the big fan who reads it every single year, as were several other people that we heard from over the course of the performance.
So no, it was really good that he was able to just poke fun at himself sometimes and just do like I think he was talking about Mackers. The fact that like Judi Dench was wearing like a towel on her head. Like it was a very like informal production. Like it wasn't very posh, and the fact that he's like, yeah, no, like when I went and got knighted by the queen, I didn't hear half the instructions. He didn't take himself seriously. Like there's a lot of actors you meet who do take their stardom and their image very seriously and do not want to waver or show behind the curtain, as it were, because that could tarnish that prestigious image that you hold of this person. But Ian McKellen is just now in his 80s, and he's like, I played Magneto, I've done Richard III, I've played Gandalf, I've done it all. Like, what more do you want from me, people?
Well, and I think that's actually something interesting about McKellen specifically, and I would probably say the same about Patrick Stewart, but these eminent knighted actors who are also nerd culture fixtures, I feel like that traversing of two worlds very much humbles them in an interesting way, even though like nerd culture probably has a higher sense of reverence for these figures than maybe even Shakespearean acting does, because nerds tend to hold their idols in very high regard. But I feel like the fact that, like, I don't know, when it was announced that Patrick Stewart, and Ian McKellen were going to be playing these comic book characters in the X-Men movies, I think, like, I recall hearing that people were like, scoffing at it or upset about, like, what's these eminent Shakespearean actors doing a superhero film? And, like, I don't know how much truth there is to that, because at that point, Patrick Stewart had already done Star Trek Next Generation, so he was already kind of a fixture in nerd culture. But that was also, like, a very, I don't know if highbrow is the right word, but like a very kind of intellectual, sort of very Shakespearean approach to Star Trek. Like that they reenact Shakespeare plays on the holodeck. Like that's so it kind of seemed natural there. But and I guess by the time they filmed the first X-Men movie, I think the first Lord of the Rings was already in production, or they were filming.
So that's the big history. Okay, is that Ian McKellen almost didn't get to play Gandalf because at the time he was contracted to do X-Men. And basically, because originally they wanted Sean Connery, right? And then Sean Connery said, I don't get it, I'm not doing it. So then one of the producers was like, well, why don't you talk to Ian McKellen?
Was that for X-Men or was that for Lord of the Rings? They wanted Connery?
Sorry, Lord of the Rings. Okay. Sean Connery was supposed to be Gandalf.
Oh, really? That would have been interesting.
Right? Yeah, no, he turned it down for League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
That was the right choice for him at that stage in his career.
Exactly. So anyway, so Ian McKellen was like, listen, I would love to do it, but I can't because I'm contracted to do this movie. But I mean, he's now very much an infamous, horrible person. But it was Harvey Weinstein who, at the time, had the rights to produce the film, or got sold to New Line. Was the one that basically went to what's his name, who directed X-Men?
Bryan Singer.
Bryan Singer, thank you.
Also a bad person.
But basically said, what's it going to take to get Ian McKellen to come and do Lord of the Rings? And Bryan Singer was like, listen, we're held up. The actor's supposed to be playing Wolverine. It's stuck on Mission Impossible 2, so we have to delay the shooting. If I can get him to you by January the 1st of 2000, would that work for you? And they're like, yes, but it has to be January the 1st. We will have literally gone through every scene we don't need him in by that time, and we need him to do the stuff. So all this stuff that it's like early on in the shoot, like the Hobbits had never met Gandalf. They're talking about scenes like, oh yeah, we just left Gandalf. So sure enough, he showed up literally on January the 1st to shoot, to start filming. So it was just luck of the draw. But X-Men almost got in the way of that. But that was the thing for Ian McKellen, is that on one hand, to nerd fans, they're like, who the heck is the Shakespeare guy? To regular Hollywood fans going, ooh, Ian McKellen and Patrick are wanting to do an X-Men and Lord of the Rings movie? Those nerd movies?
It elevates the project.
Exactly, it elevates the project, even if people didn't quite know who they were.
And I think of like Alec Guinness in the first Star Wars movie.
Yes, it's exactly like that.
You have one very prominent Shakespearean actor come in, and suddenly people take this project a little more seriously because he believes in it, even though Alec Guinness famously was just cashing a paycheck and had no interest in any of what George Lucas was like.
He wanted to get back to Stratford.
Yeah. But yeah,
either way,
I think it is important to have these like wonderful, talented, very prominent actors who really do And they just bring everyone else up to their level. Maybe not entirely to their level, but everyone comes with their A game because, well, we're acting opposite Alec Guinness or Ian McKellen or Patrick Stewart,
exactly,
et cetera.
I mean, I even like how in the show, in Jama, the little girl who he brings up doesn't recognize Patrick Stewart in the program. So he's like, "Oh, who's that? Oh, that's me. Oh, and who's that? And it's me. I don't know. Well, I won't tell Patrick Stewart that." But mind you, I think Patrick Stewart would probably laugh at it. He seems like he would. He informal guy. I mean, the fact that he wants, and the fact that they joke about doing all types of projects together. I mean, the two of them are truly really good friends, and you see that on and off camera.
And that's why the X-Men movies work so well, is because you believe that these two people who are sworn enemies actually were once friends and maybe still kind of are.
Exactly. I mean, it's interesting. He didn't talk much about X-Men in this show. He opens with Lord of the Rings, reading the infamous Balrog confrontation, the "you shall not pass" moment.
Huge round of applause. The second he ended that oration, I thought, like, is the show over? Is that just it with the amount of applause that the audience was giving? And it was only the beginning, but
but it's a great opening because once again, it's probably the line he's probably most well known for. Because I mean, everybody knows he's Magnew, but Magnew never really had like a key line that he says.
Shall not pass.
But, exactly. That will be on his tombstone.
Yes.
That will be the scene shown on all the news clips of Ian McKellen has passed away at the age of 105. Cue the clip of "You shall not pass."
Yeah, it was a very smart choice to bring us into the show, because I think for the most part, even though a lot of people in that audience are clearly very Shakespeare literate and they probably know him from all kinds of other things, I do think for a lot of the people who are alive and watching and consuming his media today, I think Lord of the Rings or the X-Men probably were the things that lured him into.
That's what I knew him for. Until I rented Richard III.
Yeah, same. Like, those were my entrance points.
Yeah, exactly. So, all right, so let's keep diving into this piece. So we open with Lord of the Rings. We get a great oration of the famous Balrog scene. Then we black out, and then we go lights up, and he's talking about, I guess, with him growing up.
Yeah, he kind of dives into some biographical details. He's like, it's kind of just filled with like little like anecdotes and quips. He mentioned meeting an actor named Timothy Carlton who said, "My name isn't actually Carlton, it's Cumberbatch. But could you imagine having a career in show business with the last name Cumberbatch?" And haha, big
my
laugh.
son's name is Benedict.
Did he say that his son was named Benedict? Okay.
So that's where I get the inference that he met Benedict Cumberbatch's father.
I didn't
or grandfather, anyway.
I didn't specifically catch that there was even a family relationship there. I thought just the punchline of the joke was, could you imagine an actor named Cumberbatch? And yes, we can, because we all know one very well now. But
who's also appeared in The Hobbit.
Yes. Very good. Not great movies, but we can let those slide. But
exactly.
Yeah.
Either way, so I mean, like, it was great hearing about his school years and just how really his origin story is like any other young artist's origin story. He gets taken to see a show. For him, it was Peter Pan. And the theater magic kind of bit him.
Yep.
And then basically we got to hear kind of the history of the English theater, of the variety shows and all the little things in the early days of, I mean, we got to hear about how, was it RADA, the Royal Academy, was started?
Yeah, RADA.
Yeah. So we got to hear like a lot of the history that, like, for the most part, a lot of us wouldn't know. Because, I mean, RADA and the Old Vic have all been well-established venues in our day and age, but we forget that when Ian McKellen was around at the turn of the century, basically, like at World War II onward, these institutions that we now revere were just beginning to fledge. Like the fact that he talks about
experiments. Yeah,
exactly. They were really experiments. The fact that he talks about how, like, yes, it was me and it was Judi Dench and Maggie Smith and who are some of the other male actors that because there's the one company that he's with that he leaves.
Derek Jacobi was
that's a running gets stuck with.
Yeah,
there's a few that he's like, I was with that's right, he was with Laurence Olivier's company, and he leaves because he's like the ninth guy on the totem pole, and he's like, this is not giving me anything. I'm gonna go to this other company and have some fun there. And he even talks about community theater. Yeah, just like how, like, they've been performing shows for 27 years. Not great shows, but shows.
Well, yeah, and the weekly rep where they, had to learn a whole show in a week, and they usually weren't very good. And then when there was the fortnightly rep, that had 2 weeks, they were marginally better. But, yeah, lots of fun stuff here. And the anecdotes are all really interesting. And it kind of, it feels like this relatable, yet I'm trying to even think what the right word for what that yet that I'm describing is. Like, his experiences are relatable, but they also open up a door to this other world, like of a time when the old Vic was a new Vic in its own way. And like, it's so hard to kind of think of what it might have been like to actually be bringing up these theaters, like when they were experiments, when they were new, when nobody knew if they were really going to work out, when they probably had a lot of rough patches along the way.
Absolutely.
And now the actors like McKellen and all of his contemporaries who we see as these huge established figures, it's basically because they're the ones that stuck with it and have been doing it as long as they have been.
Exactly. And I mean, like, in the fact he talks about like just some of like kind of not the lower class theater, but kind of like the more common theater, like the pantomimes.
Yeah.
And he talks about how like those are still important. The fact that he goes every year to the pantomimes because he really enjoys the performance. The fact that questionable now that he played Aladdin's widowed mother in a production. But I mean, once again, it's a pantomime, and it was a number of years ago when maybe
it's
we
a
weren't
product of its time.
Exactly. But that being said, like he kind of goes, he really did bring up the fact that whether it was the fortnight theater, the pantomimes, the 24-hour or week-long theater rehearsal run, he goes like it's all part and parcel to creating the artist. Like like people just don't spring from the ground to go to the old Vic. Like it's that thing of no, like it's a lot of just like he wanted to be an amateur. Like he says, like I didn't want to be a professional actor.
Eric Jacobi wanted to be professional. He'll be an amateur.
Exactly, and I mean that's what makes Ian McKellen so great. Is that really it's the common man's story. Like he's kind of once again he's showing you the peek behind the curtain of yes, I am Ian McKellen, world famous Oscar nominated, Tony and Olivier winning actor, but I am also the guy who started out doing pantomimes and playing Claudio and
and hating every moment of it.
Exactly. That's the thing. Like he really reminds actors, and I really would recommend all actors should watch this because it really kind of shows the human side of acting and the actor's journey. Like it's not all red carpets and glory. It's a lot of, hey, you got 2 weeks, put up a show, have fun. In fact, he pulls out all those old plays and he's like, yeah, we did that one. It was shit. Like, can't really say much good about it, And it's like, that's okay. That's okay. So.
Yeah, there's like a lot of really great stuff in here. And something that I also was struck by was interesting. The first reference to queerness didn't come until an hour or almost an hour into the piece.
Yes.
Which it was interesting because, like, obviously, Ian McKellen, he's an openly gay man, and, he came out in a time when that was, very, not something that a lot of people did. And he was, thankfully in show business where a lot of people, like, he specifically, the very first reference to queerness that comes up in this piece is, I think, like, I wrote 55 minutes in when he says that, it's, the theater was a place.
He was watching a show.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he gets...
Go ahead.
Yes, and him in his very British accent. Yes, I was watching the young man on stage, and I got my first erection.
Yes.
It's like only Ian McKellen in a British accent could pull that line off.
I did not realize that watching this, I would hear the story of his first erection.
Yep.
And then, and he kind of then slowly sort of unfolds the kind of counter narrative of his queer identity that was kind of going underneath the surface of everything that he talked about prior to then, but wasn't the focus. And I think that's also interesting that we could go so long without bringing it up because that doesn't have to define him. And throughout most of his career, it didn't.
It really hasn't. Like, I remember after looking him up and went, oh, he's a gay man. Like, never knew about it because he never really talks about it in interviews. Like, doing talking about with X-Men. And he mentions it in X-Men because that's what kind of drew him to the role of Magneto was how he viewed the whole concept of mutants in the X-Men world as the same as being a gay man or being gay or LGBT.
There's a lot. I don't even know if you could call that subtext, and especially the second one. Like, it's have you tried not being a mutant? Like, it's
the second one kind of gets really blatant with it.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's something that drew him to the role of Magneto to begin with, and he talks about it. But once again, like he never has been like, this defines me. It's like, no, my career, my work defines
like
me,
around
this
the
is
time
one
when
ordinary part of me.
yeah,
you
like
know?
around the time when he like first came out, and
Yeah.
I don't know if it was like the 70s or 80s. I think it did sort of define him for a little while. It never kind of took over. Like I've seen like old interviews on like Dick Cavett
Yes.
where it is an important topic of discussion because like, well, if you're going to be on the show, this is something that people recently found out about you. We can't
Yeah.
not address it. And
Yeah.
it's the 70s. Of course, we're going to address it because what else do we talk about if
Exactly.
we have
And,
a
and
gay
he
person
brings
on
up
the
that horrible bill, that Section
Mhm.
28,
Yeah.
which, I mean, the fact that we are revisiting it now
with
is
the
like,
don't say gay in Florida.
Yeah. exactly, in Texas. And there's a lot of those bills that are floating around these days. And it's like, the fact that he's like, I had to go through this in the 70s and it's coming back again, and just how that really drove him to opening up because his partner was a teacher.
Yeah.
And that's where that's where the threat really was, because he goes, I'm a gay actor on stage. Like, I have a community with me at all times. My partner could lose his job because of this section bill, whatever that Parliament's trying to pass. And the fact that really kind of woke him up to, no, I should use my platform. But once again, he never let it define him, which is something that's really powerful about him, is that he talks about it, but he never makes that an identifying feature about it. It's just, I am what I am. This is my work. This is me. Let's move. Like, let's talk about many things about me. It doesn't have to be just about the one thing that is me.
And yeah, the fact
about Ian McKellen.
Yeah, and the fact that it does come up into like almost like halfway through the show, like I think that is dramaturgically a testament to that. Yes, there's so much more about me. We're going to talk about it because that is part of who he is too. And he talks about playing Edward III, the first openly gay character in the Western canon. Like,
and the police had to come sit in the front row.
Yeah,
like in Scotland. At Edinburgh.
Yeah, and like specifically he tells about, while debating on the radio about that Section 28, he just came out in the moment there. And then and then when he came out to his family after the fact, he's like, I got to tell them before this airs that they knew all along. And it was very fun.
Well, that was such a beautiful story about him and his stepmom, Gladys, that he took to the Buckingham Palace.
Yes.
And I believe he took her to a few red carpets, but just that we drove out, we sat outside together, had a picnic. And once again, it's that classic story of, yeah, I knew. We've known for like 25 years. Thank you for coming out to me. But it's like, we love you and we accept you. It's like, that's a beautiful story.
Yeah.
The fact that he shares that so openly, it's beautiful.
And I also like how, like you mentioned, how he took Gladys to Buckingham Palace. Like that was basically, he brought up Gladys in the context of that story and then said, and then I took her to Buckingham Palace. And then suddenly he was just talking about when he got knighted. And like, that was the end of the queer talk in this piece. That it's just like, yep, that's a part of my life. I'm glad we addressed it. It's important. It defines partly who I am, but it doesn't define who I am. And there's more to it. So like I just thought, very well structured in that regard.
This show is extremely well structured. Like everything flowed. Like how he kind of went into his pantomime character because he was talking about his early career in the arts and doing the community shows and things like that. And then he flows from the pantomime into I forget what comes next, but basically it all just kind of melds together into his career, and it's really
it might have been after the pantomime. I think he talked about the black coffee scene with where he is like playing his idea of what an 80-year-old man walks like, which is ironic and funny now that he is in his 80s. But
exactly,
and then shortly after that, he did the entire Gus the Theater Cat poem.
I was so shocked, and that's how I was like, "Is he going for this?"
Well,
and I was like, All right.
I saw that segment of this as his redemption for being in that terrible movie. That he's like, these are good poems written by a fascist, but we'll put that aside, I guess. But yeah, terrible movie. We all know and agree it's terrible. Even Tom Hooper probably realizes that it's terrible.
Andrew Weber had to get a therapy dog because of how traumatized he was by cats. But yeah, like he started doing it, I was like, oh. And I mean, I will say, when you watch that movie, his solo number, well, very frustrating from a musical standpoint of he's not singing in rhythm, and that as a person who knows the music, it's like, sing on beat. Like, this isn't a monologue. This is a song. It's different. Like, but he reads it so beautifully that I'm like, oh, you are literally Gus the Theater Cat. Yeah.
Well, and that's why he was, very good casting for that role. It was
very good.
It was a very well cast piece that they did not take good. But like they had a murderer's row of like amazing talent in that, and yet they kind of botched it up with, Hooper's gonna Hooper. But but I did see like the fact that he got to do not the song version, but the actual like original Old Possum poem. That like this was his redemption, kind of.
It was.
Like you're probably waiting for me to acknowledge that I was in this really bad movie. Well, I'm not going to talk about how bad the movie is, but let me recite this fun little bouncy monologue that T.S. Eliot wrote for his niece and nephew or whatever.
Yeah, literally, yeah. And I mean, like if you read the actual book of poems, there's a few poems that you can skip, and it's like, yeah, not great. But there's certain ones like Gus the Theater Cat, Buster for Jones, that are like really good poems about British gentlemen. And it's a lot of fun. And I mean, Ian McKellen is so great in that model that when he started doing it, I was like, okay. I actually go through a whole audiobook of you reading the T.S. Eliot book of poems. Just as Andy Serkis just did a whole reading of all the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit books. Mm-hmm. You can, I would pay to hear Ian McKellen just read the Old Possum's book of poems.
Like, I would pay to hear Ian McKellen read the phone book.
Absolutely.
Which, if this whole one-man show was just that, I'd feel like, that was still worth watching.
I mean, he kind of does read the phone book in Act 2 when he's doing the French name list from Henry V.
Yeah, no, he does.
Because there's the whole, like, the actor who's playing the king or the Dauphin was given a blank sheet of papers and the name of all the characters, so he starts making them up.
Yeah. No, that was really fun. Do we want to start talking about Act 2? Because Act 2 was very focusedly about one thing in particular, whereas Act 1 is more about his life, anecdotes, various roles. Were there other things about Act 1 that you wanted to address before we start talking about Act 2?
I do want to say the poem that he ends the first act with was really beautiful. And the fact that it's a queer playwright, and it talks about aging, because I mean, he could have ended the first act with the 7 Ages of Man speech.
Yes.
But he opens Act 2 with it, which is just fine as well. But I was waiting for that speech to come up somewhere in this show. The fact that I actually went and looked up that poem afterwards, because I was like, oh, wow. This is actually a really beautiful poem about aging.
Yeah.
And it's such a unique way to end the first act.
Yeah. No, I agree. I thought that was such a strong ending. And like, honestly, because like we watched it on the National Theatre at Home where they have the built-in like 2-minute intermission in the recording. So I kind of got to the end of Act 1 and I'm like, I have no idea what act, like that felt like a complete piece. Like, like it was a very strong ending. It didn't like leave anything hanging like a promise for, but just wait. In Act 2, you'll hear about it was just, that could have very well been the end of it. Like if anyone like left during intermission, I don't advise them to do that, but they would have, I think, felt like they had seen a complete performance.
And that's what I'll say is, I feel like because Ian McKellen was only ever going to do one-man show, he combined 2 separate one-man shows and made them into one. Like, I feel like his Shakespeare show could have been extended into a full one-act piece, and then this piece could have maybe taken a few more of the Shakespeare elements, put them into Act 1, and then basically called it a day at the end of Act 1 there. Because I too went, wait a minute. I still have like another hour of this thing. Like, I'm enjoying it tremendously, but what the heck are we going to do? Like, are we going to get a whole second act all about Magneto and more Gandalf stories? Like, what are we doing in Act 2?
Well, and then Act 2, so let's kind of get into Act 2, because Act 2 did something very specific. He introduced it with the 7 Ages of Man speech from As You Like It, and then if Act 1 was kind of about his life in theater, his career, especially some kind of very prominent film roles, Act 2 was about his relationship to Shakespeare. And
very prominent.
Yeah, very prominent, a huge part of his life, and it wasn't really addressed very much in the first half because I guess it was all coming at the end. And that, like you said, I think it could have been 2 completely separate shows because like they are sort of doing their own thing separately. I'm kind of glad he did combine them for reasons that I think we'll talk about later. But yeah, Act 2 was basically, let's talk about every single Shakespeare show. He kind of jokingly says to the audience at the beginning of it, like, who can name all, was it 38? 37? Because the numbers vary, and we'll talk about that, don't you worry. But it's like, who can name all 37 Shakespeare plays? Let's name all of them right now. And like, they laugh like it's a joke, but then he says, like, somebody shout out a Shakespeare play, and then that same kid from the beginning, she's, he calls upon her specifically, and she says, Macbeth. And he's like, don't say it in the theater. But and then he starts talking about Mackers, And then he keeps just asking for more suggestions from the audience.
He does Cymbeline next, which I was like, okay, all right. Like, is he going to go through the entire 37, or is he just going to do like 5? And
by the time he got to the third one, I could tell that, okay, we're actually doing this.
We're doing this. Let's do it.
Yeah, which was funny because when he... And this kind of goes back to like the sort of stand-up comedy, improvisational feel of the whole piece, is that when he called back to that kid from the beginning to get the ball rolling with the very first one, and then he instantly went into what seemed like a very well-polished and rehearsed monologue about Mackers, I kind of had a thought, and I'm like, wait a minute. This feels too polished. Like, this is very similar to, at time of recording this, we have just literally yesterday released our Fringe Roundup episode. Yep. We're probably going to release this much later because this is very troveable content, but treasure trove as we call it. Yep. It's not topical, doesn't have to come out at a certain time. But we just very recently had our whole Fringe Roundup, and something I said in response to one of the pieces.
And I thought about this too.
Well, yeah. So one of the pieces, too much information improvised. I kind of had a very light critique of that show, is that even though I genuinely believe that it was improv, the very minimal ways that it actually solicited suggestions from the audience and kind of aesthetically made it feel like it wasn't improv. And like, I think that's a valid critique of that when we, it is the fact that suggestions are being given in improv that authorizes the fact that you are indeed making this up on the spot. Yeah. Like, you could completely make something up on the spot without soliciting suggestions, but then how does the audience know that you didn't write it in advance? So when he called upon that same kid from the beginning and then instantly followed up her suggestion of Mackers with, here's a very well-rehearsed monologue about some interesting facts about Mackers and my relationship to it, I'm like, was that kid a plant? Because...
Well, my thought was, did the ushers come up and tell the kid and intermission go, yeah, Mackers, yes.
That's a type of
see
plant.
Mackers, exactly.
Exactly. It just seemed
the kid.
It just seemed too polished, and that kind of oh, but that kid was so cute, and if she was just a plant in this whole thing, then that kind of colors the way I think back of her appearance on stage earlier. But then when the next one was Cymbeline, and then he went into his monologue, and then by number 3 I realized that, okay, he has something rehearsed to say about every single Shakespeare play, so it doesn't matter what order they come up in. Yeah. And
the fact that it's all just a blank stage, so there's no tech cues. So the tech people aren't sitting agitatedly backstage going, what cue do we do next? It's nope, it's just a whitewashed stage with an armchair and a suitcase.
So, and that's what kind of sold me on what Act 2 was doing here, because it is still improvised in that he could say it in any order, but it was also still rehearsed and pre-scripted that he knows exactly what he's going to say the second each one comes up. So I thought that was an interesting take on this being openly amendable to the order, but not to the letter of the text.
Well, it just shows once again, even at 80, just how his mental dexterity. Yeah. That one night he could start with Cymbeline, because Titus Andronicus, because there's some cheeky bastard in the audience who's going to try and trip him up, and not name one of the common ones. And then he gets it, and in fact, it's a whole big Romeo and Juliet monologue, and he does the Cymbeline monologue. He does a whole section of Mackers text. All the fact that there's certain ones that he kind of drifts through. So, I think it'd be interesting if somebody started with Merry Wives of Windsor or Pericles.
Cymbeline is kind of one like that.
Yeah,
for the most part.
Exactly. That's where I was somebody trying to trip him up with Cymbeline, to see what he's going to do. It's nope, he knows that monologue.
Yeah. And he is a Shakespearean actor with a capital S, because how else do you spell Shakespearean? But no, with a capital S. So yeah, he knows these plays like the back of his hand. He has something interesting to say about every single one of them, even some that he said less about than others. Yeah. I just see that as he's more interested in some than others, but doesn't mean that he's not familiar, except for Troilus and Cressida.
Yeah, Troilus and Cressida.
Which it almost I feel like that was so funny, because that was the second last one where he basically just says Troilus and Cressida. I have nothing to say about Troilus and Cressida, which it would have been funny if that was one night they performed it and that was the first one, and then it kind of spills the beans and gives up the game a little early. But it was very funny, at least in this recording, that came pretty much at the very end after he's just said so much about so many of them, and then I have nothing to say about Troilus and Cressida.
And I mean, since we're getting into the things he doesn't have much to say about, there were a few that he missed.
Yeah, let's talk about the canon, why don't we?
Yeah. So this all started when I messaged you during watching it, being like, am I crazy or did he miss the Winter's Tale?
And, well, it's funny because he missed, by our count, as we were kind of texting back and forth last night, I didn't catch that he had missed any. I kind of just took it. Because here's the thing, he has all of his Shakespeare books on stage. And, I'm very interested in what does it mean when you have books on stage. Like, especially, I've talked about this in other episodes, like at the library at night, and specifically how it kind of plays into my work in adaptation studies, is that if adaptation is, very often about the relationship between the book and the stage and, taking something that exists in one medium and bringing it to another, what does it mean symbolically when you bring back the old discarded medium and have it play a prominent role in the piece? So I was kind of like looking at these Shakespeare books, and I like, when he first started doing it, I'm like, it's kind of interesting that the books are playing such a prominent role, like they're kind of almost another character on stage, when his performance as an actor is precisely what lifts them off the page. And it's not, we didn't need to have those books here as just as like visual indications of, this is Richard III. Like, no, you, Sir Ian, are Richard III. Like, so like, I thought it was interesting to even have the books. But then, like, as he was going through all of them, it occurred to me that the books are there, and as he's stacking each one on the table after he speaks of it, they're a counter. Like, that is how he's counting and making sure that regardless of the order, he touches on all of them. Yeah. And yet, he doesn't, which I think is so strange, because if he has all the books, you'd think it would enforce the fact that he will address all of them. So how did he miss the three that we noticed, and well, three and change, which we could talk about in a moment? First, you pointed out A Winter's Tale, or The Winter's Tale. Yeah. And then the really strange one that he forgot, Othello. Yes. Which is one of the most famous ones.
I'm surprised he's never played Iago. Like, that'd be like a young Ian McKellen role for sure.
Yeah, I feel like he's a little old for it now, but like
mind you, he just played Hamlet. Yeah. Like, so I mean, he could go in and play Iago now. Yeah. If he really wanted to.
But yeah, it's very strange. Like Othello, like Winter's Tale, sure, it's plausible that nobody in the audience would think to bring it up or notice that it was missing from the list. But yeah, Othello, it was very strange that wasn't on there. And then the one that I added as we were kind of texting back and forth is Two Noble Kinsmen wasn't there either. How dare you miss Two Noble Kinsmen? But well, this is interesting because the canon of Shakespeare is very malleable. We kind of, the reason why I said, like, oh, remind me, did he say 37 or 38? Or because, there isn't really a fixed number that we can point to for, like, these are all the plays that Shakespeare wrote. And co-authorship and the Shakespeare Apocrypha is a big part of this. So Two Noble Kinsmen is co-written, or at least widely believed to be co-written, between Shakespeare and John Fletcher. So one could say that, oh, Two Noble Kinsmen isn't on the list because he's not including anything that Fletcher got his grubby little hands on. But that's not true, because when he did his bundle of the Henrys, he included Henry VIII, which is also co-written by John Fletcher. Yeah. So be consistent, Ian. Make up your mind.
Well, it talks about Thomas More at the end.
Well, yeah. Well, I will give a pass for that. Like, Thomas More is interesting and strange. Like, I don't know. Like, we don't need to get into this that much, but like, I think the jury is still out on whether or not Hand D, as it's called, is actually Shakespeare's hand. Like that, whether or not Shakespeare actually wrote pieces of that, or whether or not we can prove it. Stylometry is a very imperfect science, so I don't know how much we can really say about that. But he also mentioned Pericles, like, that is co-written by that other playwright whose name I always forget, like, and the ones that we kind of know to be co-authored. And like, if we even expand further out, like Oxford University Press in around 2016, they confirmed again through the very imperfect science of stylometry that Christopher Marlowe can be proven to have had a hand in Henry VI, and now in all Oxford editions of Henry VI, that is written by William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe. And for a long time, there's been a lot of debate and perhaps even some compelling evidence that Mackers was also collaboratively written with Thomas Middleton, and some editions do include Thomas Middleton as the author of Mackers, and I think that's one that people really don't want to give up, because sure, Henry VI, nobody cares about that, or Pericles, whatever, but Mackers, that is Shakespeare with a capital S. So I think people are a little more protective of that one, a little territorial. But then he brings up Sir Thomas More at the end, after he's done his entire kind of catalog of all the Shakespeares, all in big quotation marks. Like, that one I'll give a pass, because he's, it was very much open for debate for a long time. He seems to come down on the side that it is indeed Shakespeare, and since he's the one who originated the role, is the one of the only living people to have originated a role written by Shakespeare, it makes sense that Sir Ian would have vested interest in propping up Shakespeare's partial authorship of Sir Thomas More.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've been ranting about the canon.
No, this is great. I mean, for me, like, I just go, when I was watching, he was getting to the end, and he's like, oh yeah, the Tempest. And I was like, wait, we're just gonna brush through the Tempest? Like, I'm sure you got some story.
He brushed through the Tempest to go back to Mackers, which he'd already done.
I know, and I was like, we didn't really talk about Mackers here. Like, I thought we covered Mackers already.
That
was our number one. So, like, why are we brushing through the Tempest when, like, I don't know if he's played Prospero yet.
I don't know. It feels like a perfect fit for him. Like, every actor of a certain age has to play Prospero at some point. But
every actor and actress. I mean, Helen Mirren's played, Prospera, as she was renamed. Anyway. So, I mean, the fact that he's like, it felt like the end was like, maybe like it was like going to like, oh crap, it's already like 11 o'clock, like pubs are closing, we gotta get out of here. Like,
it is also possible that he did go through all of them, but then when they edited it for film, this version that we watched, that maybe they cut a few for time. But I also,
because there's like 2.5 hours already, so.
Yeah, but the reason why I don't know if I believe that to be the case is because you'd think Othello, of all things, would have made the cut, because that's one that people would definitely notice as missing.
Cut Pericles.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, as much as you and I both like Pericles.
I like Pericles a lot. I've always had a soft spot for it.
And I mean, if we're trying to Pericles, look up here. You can check out our review of the Stratford production that starred our friend Bridget.
Yeah, we've reviewed so many of these plays.
True.
Check out all of them.
It's true. And I mean, that's the fun part of that, was getting to hear these anecdotes. And I mean, the fact that he had the book, so like, he was like, oh yeah, on the cover, it's this guy who's played like, I forget which one he holds up, but it's like, he's played that role, like, King Lear.
Yeah.
When he holds up this King Lear copy, even though he has played Lear, his thing of like, oh yeah, this guy's played it like 3 different times. And he has like a little anecdote, and the pictures in the book of like, oh yes, and here's Richard III, and yes, inside there's a picture of Maggie Smith drinking her Coca-Cola. And I was like, I was waiting for him to do a Maggie Smith impression, because that is a long-running feud joke between them, as Maggie Smith's doing the "stop doing impressions of me, Ian," and every time he does an interview or a show, he like does an impression of their conversations.
I guess because that's circulated enough, he didn't feel the need to put it into the show itself. Like,
and that's something also I appreciate is like, yes, he talks about Richard III, but he doesn't tell the same story. Like, there's a very famous interview of him talking about how so something happened with him on set with Maggie Smith, and there's a very famous Richard III scene after the princess had been killed, and she does the like, because I forget who she plays. I think it's Queen Anne or somebody. Anyway, she does the like, where are my sons? Basically, is the big monologue, and something happened where like either she fell down the stairs or flubbed a line. Anyway, he's told that story in other interviews with Maggie when he's kind of bashing on Maggie Smith, and it's like the fact that like he didn't do that. Like, once again, he found a new story to tell it. Like, and that's where like that improv, just naturalistic conversation comes out of. Oh yes, Richard III, and oh yes, there's me on the cover, and yes, you can buy this particular copy of Richard III in the lobby, and and here's some fun stories of that, and there we go. Like, next, and it's like, oh, okay, all right, we're not dwelling on too much, like we're kind of moving along. Like, there's some more he kind of gave more time to, like R&J, where he's like, yes, R&J, very, very, very popular, and he does the whole Richard or Romeo and Juliet monologues from that, and you could tell there were ones he had more to say. And I mean, the fact is, like, I gotta want to play Falstaff, and it's not the padding; it's the fact that there's been too many great Falstaffs, including Roger Allam, who I was like, I know who that is, the original Inspector Javert in Les Mis. And the fact that he talks about like there's the musical version of, I think it's Comedy of Errors or Much Ado, that Trevor Nunn directed. And he's like, yes, if that hadn't happened, then no Les Mis, no Cats. It was like all the fun little like, only Ian McKellen would know these stories. And once again, it's making Shakespeare personable. He's taking the austereness out of those things, all at the same time giving some very dramatic, really good monologue readings where it's like, oh wow, okay, that's worth my money right there. And in fact, he talks about like, yes, I missed this actor performing this particular role, and I wish I had
made a point of seeing Cher.
And this very heartfelt story of, yes, and I miss Judy Garland, and she never performed again, and that's why I saw Cher. It's like, that story took a right turn at the end. I could not
miss the opportunity to see Cher with the track record that he's had.
Well, because he missed Frank Sinatra, he missed Judy, Elvis. He missed Elvis. Like there's it's this really sad kind of like all these greats that he's missed out on, and it's like. And that's why I went and saw Cher.
But he's Ian McKellen. He can probably call up anyone in the world, any celebrity that he wants to spend time with or hang out, and just be like, hey, you want to hang out and perform a scene for/with me? That would be fun for us to do.
I would watch a whole YouTube channel of just Ian McKellen calling up fellow celebrities and doing Zoom calls where they just perform a scene.
It would be like a much more entertaining version of like the Jerry Seinfeld comedians in cars getting coffee. Like, yeah, which I've tried watching. Like, I love Seinfeld, but I find that show unwatchable. I like the comedians.
I don't mind it. It's very kind of just naturalist.
I just find it so tedious. Like, I'm like, this actually isn't very interesting at all. Even if
it's a show about nothing.
Well, yeah, it's literally the show about nothing that George Costanza always wanted. But you know, people joke that's what Curb eventually turned out to be. Is Larry David got the show that he actually wanted, but Curb is so intricate. Whereas comedians in cars getting coffee, that's actually about nothing. Yeah. So I also think it's interesting. You brought up something about how he makes Shakespeare like more approachable. He takes it out of this kind of stuffy ivory tower sort of idea. And that kind of calls to my mind something that he said very close to the beginning of the show. And he talked about, he smirked while talking about a silent film adaptation of Shakespeare. And the guy
originated Rada.
Yeah. Yeah. And he said, I wrote down the quote, Shakespeare without words. It's a bit like Mozart without the music. Ha ha ha. But, and like, you know, it's true and it's funny. And like, there actually is, you know, a fair bit of scholarship on the interesting, you know, concept of silent movie Shakespeare, because like Deborah Cartmel has written a lot about this. It's interesting, but I think actually, while I get the quip that he's making, I think he's actually kind of missing the point about something important here. Is that, sure, Shakespeare didn't invent most of his stories. He got them from sources in the canon. But he kind of did something very similar to what Walt Disney did many centuries later, which is that he took something that was pre-existing in the public domain, although Shakespeare existed pre-copyright, so the concept of the public domain, while it very much did exist, didn't exist in those terms.
Yeah.
But he took something that exists in the public domain, and through his own blunt force of canonicity, he created the official versions that come to our mind when we think of this. So to say like, oh, a silent film version of Shakespeare is getting rid of the best part, i.e. Shakespeare's, you know, brilliant poetry, like that's true. But what's actually happening here is it is showing that Shakespeare has transcended the words that Shakespeare actually wrote. It's that his versions of these stories are the official versions. So if you do a silent film version of, I think it was King John in that little anecdote.
Yes, it was. Yes.
It's
of all the places to do a silent film of, it's King John.
Yeah, well, whatever. But like, that's the thing. You could have just said this is a silent movie about the historical figure of King John, but it's not. It's a silent film of Shakespeare's King John, and it doesn't need to have Shakespeare's words to be just that. Yeah. And I think that's interesting. And, you know, actors like McKellen as these sort of vehicles for Shakespeare and for culture and like for Tolkien even. He mentioned at one point, I wrote this down too, he says like, anybody born in New Zealand, raise hands. Anybody ever been to New Zealand? Anybody ever been on a stamp in New Zealand? And he's the only one raising his hand. And like when he was telling this sort of fun little joke about how he's the only one in that room who's been on a stamp and a coin in New Zealand, the idea struck me is that like, wow, Lord of the Rings is so fundamental to New Zealand culture, like, which is kind of crazy when you think about, like, it's just by fluke of the fact that Peter Jackson happened to film them there. Yeah. Like, but like, and it has had this huge, you know, for better, for worse. And there's been a lot of worse in terms of what the filming of specifically the Hobbit movies did to
there's a whole interesting documentary about that.
Yes, I've seen it. But there's Like, I just think it's so interesting that Tolkien wanted to write a new English fairy tale. And while he did indeed succeed in that goal, he probably never realized that he was literally writing what would become a huge part of New Zealand's culture.
It's true, and it still is, because I mean, the new Lord of the Rings that's coming out was filmed in New Zealand, so it's like Middle Earth has been co-opted into like New Zealand's heritage now. Like, there will never not be that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so just the fact that, Ian McKellen is literally on a stamp. It's in New Zealand. It's not because he's, this great English actor, let's put him on a stamp. It's because he played the wizard from the thing they all like.
Exactly. And I mean, the fact that he even talks about how, like, he met Sir Edmund Hillary. Mm-hmm. And, like, that guy's been on a stamp. And, I think it's a £5 bill in New Zealand. Either way, but the fact is, like, yes, I met that person. And, like, he's like, yeah, no, it was great. And it's like, yes, but I've also been on a stamp too. So it's like,
yeah. And he even said, like, who's been on a stamp? And a coin. Actually, no, that wasn't me. That was Gandalf. So, like, which is interesting. That way he kind of thinks of his characters as separate from himself, which is...
Well, he's very big on that. Like, it's very kind of the British theatrical acting non-method style, which is he puts on the hat, the nose, the grey cape, and he becomes Gandalf the Grey. And he takes it all off, and he's now just Sir Ian McKellen, pub owner of England. And there's a great, I forget who interviewed him more. There's a great sketch video of where he's explaining his acting process. It's like, I'm Sir Ian, Sir Ian, Sir Ian, Sir Ian. You shall not pass. Sir Ian, Sir Ian, Sir Ian, Sir Ian, Sir Ian.
Oh, that's fun.
And it's like, that really is who he is. And I think that was the big thing that came out of this was Ian McKellen is a guy like you and me who puts his pants on one leg at a time. He's just had the opportunities from his hard work to have been given the chance to play some very iconic roles and to explore and perform some very special texts. But really, he is a very genuine... The fact that, like, he's outside his theater at intermission and somebody mistakes him for Michael Gambon from Harry Potter.
And then he asks Michael Gambon, like, do you ever get mistaken for me? Yep, I just sign your name. And hopefully he spells it right, because that was also a recurring joke throughout this. People spell his name incorrectly with an A all the time.
And there's a running joke in The Hobbit, behind the scene features, that they had a dummy Ian McKellen Gandalf figure, and on the call sheet he was called Michael Gambon, because it looks like Michael Gambon. So... once again, but like, that's Ian McKellen. Like, he's got these running jokes with all these actors. Kenneth Branagh, produced by Kenneth Branagh. Yes, I am mistaken for Michael Gambon all the time. I am not Dumbledore. Even though he was offered the role. He was their initial pick. But because Richard Harris didn't like Ian McKellen's acting, Ian McKellen was like, yeah, I'll never replace Richard Harris in a role like that, just because he would not have liked it. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, the Elseworld opportunities of Ian McKellen as Dumbledore would have been a very interesting performance.
And I wonder how that would have been addressed in this one-person show.
Right? Because
that was a whole other chapter. Like, would it be like a Magneto that barely gets mentioned at all? Or would it be like a Gandalf where it takes up so much of the first half?
Right? And I mean, the fact that he has that running joke of, I played the real wizard.
Yes.
Gandalf.
No, it's fun. Yeah, this was just such a fun piece. He's such like
it was.
Like, I knew he was like a very like down-to-earth, fun, charismatic guy, but I think watching this really just made it so clear to me that he is just a hoot. He's like having fun. He's an octogenarian. It doesn't really he doesn't care. He's not profiting off the show. It's just for charity. He's just inviting people to hang out with him. And like, it's still a show, and he's still put a lot of work and effort into what it is. It's not literally just like, so yeah, I'm here. Anyone have questions for me? I guess like it is still.
And there are those shows that exist that are and it's like
and I think like people would be into that if he did it. Like
sure.
Like it's kind of like when you go to like Comic-Con and you line up for hours to meet a celebrity you like, and you get to ask them a question. Like there is appeal to that kind of thing. But yeah, I think this was the perfect blend of both, is what this piece was, that you get to feel like, even us watching it mediated through a screen, we're not there at the Harold Pinter Theater with him, but we still kind of feel like it's not even like a peek behind the curtain as much as it is like, yes, he is a real person and this is who he is. It both is and is not the version of him that you're used to seeing in movies.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I also will say the ending was very funny, where he shows up in the box.
Yes.
Which is a great callback to the first act of when him and his director were staging the piece, and he says, you should start the show in the box.
Yes. Why? Because the audience will like it. And then
Which, once again, that brings up a great question of, when you're staging a piece, do you do it because the audience will like it, or do you do it because it has some dramaturgical sense?
Yes.
To the piece.
And like in this case, like it's both. Is that by playing it as a callback. Like he could have just as easily started the show popping out of the box like, boom, it's McKellen, y'all. But I think it was so much more impactful that like he made the offhand joke about it earlier that you kind of, it's funny because when he said that at the beginning, I had it in my head that like at some point before the end of this, he will be inside that box. And yet when he actually did it, I had forgotten that I had thought that, which was so great that he like, when he popped out, I was like, oh my God, he did the thing.
He did the box. What's in the box?
Ian is in the box.
Ian is in the box.
But yeah, that was so fun. And it was like really well done because we already kind of had like 2 fake out endings, or 3 if you count the one at the very beginning that I commented on earlier.
Yeah.
But, he finishes his Macker/Tempest mashup, and we've gone through all of the Shakespeare plays. And then blackout, big applause, and then he comes back and he does the whole Sir Thomas More thing. It's like, here's a Shakespeare play that you wouldn't have even thought to mention because is it even a Shakespeare play? Who's to say? And then he does all of that, and we get the blackout once again. And, we feel like we've already had our encore. Like, this is it. The show's got to be over by now. And then he pops out of the box.
And he's having a blast when he pops out of that box, too. It's not a begrudging pop out of the box. It's like, aha! Like, I actually enjoyed surprising you on this one.
Yeah, and it's the dramaturgical construction of this piece, is he could have just as easily started with that, but he knew it would be so much more satisfying if the audience was primed to find it interesting, not just to find it interesting because it happens.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Do you have anything else you want to discuss from this show?
I don't know.
I feel like we've covered a lot of it.
Yeah, we've covered a lot. Like, there's little tiny things like that I could bring up. But like at the end of the day, like, it's just a fun show. I encourage people to watch it. I know we've spoiled a lot of it, but I don't even know if you really can spoil. We've spoiled the box. That's the one thing that it would have been very nice for people to go in completely surprised.
Sure.
But for the most part, this is just like watch this. Just spend time with this very interesting, talented, remarkable person. It's worth your time to do so.
And I will say, Ian McKellen, if you do end up watching this and you'd like to come on and do a video chat with us, and we can talk about why Othello and The Winter's Tale were missed.
You don't have to defend yourself. It's fine.
No, we would just love to talk to you in general.
Yes, but like by all means, if you can spare the time.
Yes.
No, we're big fans. We love your work a lot.
Yes, we would love to have you on and just to chat. Share and impart some fun wisdoms.
Get down in those comments.
Yeah. If you want Ian McKellen, start the petition. We'll happily do a roundtable with him.
Yes, that'd be fun.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that kind of wraps up this review. Mac, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank
you, Sir Ian, for having such an illustrious career and doing this wonderful piece. We raise our cups to you.
Huzzah!
Before we go, Mac, would you like to plug your socials?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So you can follow me at Mackenzie Horner on all social media platforms. Follow my musical antics, and there was some singing in this with Cup of Hemlock, or with Before the Downbeat.
Cup of Hemlock, you silly goat.
Yeah, exactly. So follow Before the Downbeat, a musical podcast. We actually did do a review of the film Cats, where we do talk about Ian McKellen's performance.
Do you want him to see that after we just spoke to him personally?
Yes. Absolutely, it's fine. We give him a very good reviews.
That's good.
He is one of the standouts of that film. So, very good. Yeah, but yes, check that out. Before the Downbeat a Musical podcast. We're currently working on season 5. Don't know when it will come out yet. Probably sometime in September. So, lots of time to catch up. But there we go. Ryan, give us that classic Ryan Borochovitz send-off.
You don't bother looking for me on social media
unless you're Ian McKellen.
Yes, unless you're Ian McKellen. If Ian McKellen sends me a message, I will respond. But no, for the most part, if you like me, just follow Cup of Hemlock. That's COH Theater on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Yeah, if you're watching this on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe. Do the YouTube things. If you're listening to this as a podcast, do the same stuff, but for a podcast with your ears. That's it for us. Thank you for listening. Thanks for joining us. And yeah, we'll see you next time.
Huzzah. Adios. You shall